Stanford University.
Is this on? Yes. Well, congratulations. Everybody has survived the midterm, including the TAs so far, who recently have been let out of their entombment with thousands of pages of exam pages. So those are rolling along, and everybody is still awake, so that's good. Okay, so we have now officially entered the second half of the course. And organizational things, readings will now be read, hopefully. Okay, so that's not useful. Books. Now is a good time to actually go and start reading those books. And again, if you are not up to all of both of them, some recommended chapters have come along. And pay attention to those. And again, a subset of you may not know it yet, but about 25% of you will have your life transformed by that chaos book, whereas 25% will resent the purchase price and by forcing you to do this. Also, another major transition here, which is, as far as I can tell so far, I have run out of steam turning the extended notes into actual expository writing. So they're just going to take the form of really poorly organized outlines. And so that happens. Okay. What else? What we now transition to is going to be our strategy for the rest of our course, which is to look at various subjects. And coming down the pike after the lectures today and Friday on sexual behavior will be aggression, competition, cooperation, empathy, potentially language use, schizophrenia. Somewhere in there, there's going to be a week or so on that chaos stuff. But for all of these subjects, we are now going to follow the general strategy. We will start off looking at what the behavior is. And what we're going to try to do there, in addition to looking at it in lots of different species, is to be as objective as any good old ethologist in considering the fixed action patterns of a particular behavior. That established, with the promise that in lots of cases what we think comprise some of these behaviors turn out not to be the case. That established, what we will start is our inexorable march to the left, the timeline that constitutes everything we learn now, stepping back and saying, okay, 1 millisecond before that behavior occurred, what was going on in the brain? What parts of the brain, what neurotransmitters, all of that. Stepping back before that, a second before, a minute before, whatever, what was it in the environment that triggered the brain to produce that behavior? What was the acute releasing stimulus? Stepping back, what do hormone levels that hour, that day, some such time span of that, what acute hormonal exposure had to do with sensitizing you to the environmental stimulus, which released the nervous system into generating behavior, marching all the way back, throwing in culture someplace or other, perinatal effects, early developmental hormonal stuff, eventually considering what do the genetics of the individual, of the population, of the species, evolution kicking in there someplace or other, what do all of these things and something having to do with ecology thrown in there just for good measure, working our way back in each of these cases, understanding what was the biology of 1 second before, 1 minute, 1 hour, 1 million years before that gave rise to it. Back to our two major themes from day one. We are now about to be unbound, unfettered by our buckets, our categorical buckets, and instead explore their interactions. The other being that notion from the very first class, which is at any given point, if we're talking about chronic hormonal effects on this behavior, what we're talking about is the way those hormone patterns were shaped during this period, the way genes contributed to the enzymes that make the hormones, the receptors. The second you're talking about genetics, all of this is becoming apparent. At every one of these points, whatever point we are talking about is going to be the end product of everything to the left and just this temporary sort of footing before going to the things on the right. So this will be our strategy forever after now. So we start off doing this with looking at sexual behavior, the neurobiology and the endocrinology and the early experiences, et cetera, et cetera. So to inaugurate the second half of the course, and the fact that it's starting off with lectures on sexual behavior, it has to start off with the stupid obligatory sex joke. Okay. So the Martians come to Earth, and they turn out to be great guys. They're really terrific. They get along wonderfully with Earthlings. All of them like each other a lot. They're all becoming great friends. They pass their hours learning about each other's planets. What's the weather like there? What are sports like here? What are recipes? Everybody's getting along terrifically. And eventually, the Earthlings and the Martians are getting along well enough that they get around to asking the question that everybody's really interested in, which is, well, how do you folks go about reproducing? So the decision is made, the Martians are going to go first, so they clear out a big space, and a whole bunch of Martians come in there, and they stand on top of each other's heads, and their noses flash different colors, and steam comes out of various orifices, and there's clanking noises and whatever, and out pops a new little Martian. And the Earthlings say, wow, that was great, and love the concept, and I got great video of that, and that's terrific, and all of that. Okay, so that's worked out, and now it's the humans' turn. So a willing couple is found, and some space is cleared out, and the Martians sit down there with their video cameras as well, and clicking away, and this couple goes at it, and they finish the whole thing in a sweaty mess at the end, and the Martians say, that's wonderful, that's so interesting, you Earthlings are just endless, and the fascinating things you do, but we have one question though. And which is, so where's the new human? And he said, oh, that takes 9 months. They said, well, why were they in such a rush at the end? So our first question here is, why were they in such a rush at the end? Okay, 3 possible answers. Choice number 1, vote for it. Why were they in such a rush at the end? Number 1, because they were acting with this fervent desire to do something for the good of the species. Just seeing if any hands go up, that's a good thing. Option number 2, doing that because you want to maximize the number of copies of your genes passed on to the next generation. Option number 3, because it feels good. Okay, 1 hand goes up, and I'm not sure what that indicates about everyone, but I will remind you from the survey in the first class there that a far greater percentage of you want to learn about depression than about sexual behaviors. So there you have it with the Stanford experience. Okay, because it feels good. And what we deal with here right off the start is this important dichotomy between proximal and distal explanations for behavior. A distal explanation for sexual behavior, parentheses, why were they in such a rush at the end, passing on copies of your genes, the effects of hormones on certain reward pathways in the brain, all of that. Proximal mechanism being that it feels good. And starting off, right off the bat, the thing to make sense of with sexual behavior is it is driven by this amazing little loop here of sensory stimuli and feedback and immediate sensations that drive the behavior coming out. And all this stuff down here is for the doctoral thesis somewhere down the line. That's not what the motivation is. Probably more than any other of the behaviors we will look at, the driving forces are very proximal ones. Nobody sits there and figures out how many copies of genes they are passing on and thus are willing to speed up to produce a new human 9 months later. It is instead, in species after species, it is proximal motivating mechanisms for generating the behaviors. Okay, so beginning to look at the actual behaviors, there is a funny duality to making sense of sexual behavior across different species, a funny sort of contrast. The first one being that, well, all species go about sex, or all vertebrate species go about sex in a roughly similar way, yet you don't want it to be too similar to the species next door. There's an interesting sort of dichotomy there. All sorts of vertebrate species are doing things with pelvic thrusting and orgasms, and stay tuned, that's coming, and ejaculation and lordotic reflexes and things of that sort, highly conserved fixed action patterns. patterns across lots and lots of different species. Nonetheless, amid that, you've got this other problem, which is you want to have these fixed action patterns being specific to your species. You do not want to mess up. So there's this strange simultaneity of very, very conserved basic building blocks of the fixed action patterns of sexual behavior, but along with that, a lot of selectivity within species. Now, how does that selectivity begin to work? What you get is this very interesting interplay, this intercalation between the releasing stimuli and the fixed action patterns. What you get is this chaining of behavior. In other words, the fixed action pattern of one of the individuals constitutes the releasing stimulus for the other individual's fixed action pattern, which constitutes the releasing stimulus for this individual's fixed action pattern. This chaining of transitions there, of interplay between these two, which is where you get the species specificity from. Okay. So in terms of making sense of that, of course, any of this in terms of looking at the general features of how to think about sexual behavior across species, of course, what you have to have out the wazoo is your basic ethology credo of interviewing an animal in its own language about its sexual behavior, wonderfully summarized in this quote by Martha McClintock, researcher. I think I've used this quote already, which is, in her particular case, studying female rat sexual behavior, which turns out to be this very ornate process involving a lot of running around on the part of the female. Studying female rat sexual behavior in a cage is like trying to study swimming behavior of a dolphin in a bathtub. You need to get it in the natural setting, or else you are going to lose all sorts of insight in the particular realm of female rat sexual behavior. The standard picture for decades and decades, the centuries where our finest minds have looked at rats having sex, the standard dogma has been that the female role is a very passive, receptive one. And it turns out it's a very passive, receptive one if she doesn't have enough room to run around and do all sorts of courting stuff on her own, all sorts of proceptive sexual behaviors, which she can't see if you're studying an animal in a setting where they can't speak in their own language. So a big, big sort of vote for ethological principles when it comes to this. All right, so just to get some jargon under our belt right from the start here, in terms of how the professionals talk about sex when they're talking about sex and trying to sound like professionals, here are some of the terms. Old, outdated term, Freudian term that nonetheless has entered the general sort of world of referring to sexual arousal and motivation, libido. Libido, as we will see, that commonplace everyday usage term, is perhaps more technically described as horniness, but can also be described as one term within a trio of the terms that people in the business really use most frequently: attractivity, proceptivity, and receptivity. Quick get to work on poems about those three terms, but what you've got here is attractivity, how attractive an individual is to someone else. Receptivity, how receptive that individual is to the interest of the other individual. Proceptivity, the active behaviors that are carried out in response to being attracted to. And thus you could say, because of the attractiveness of this organism, this other organism began proceptive behaviors which did or did not prove to meet with receptive fixed action patterns and responses. The very words any of us would use to describe what goes on at a party. Okay, so we've got that triad there, the terms that are much more in common than terms like libido or arousal or motivation. These are the more common ones. What is another realm, and terms that are much more used, these are much more zoology terms. What's used far more often in clinical medicine is a description, a dichotomy between motivation and performance. And that is never used more frequently than in the realm of making sense of sexual motivation in men as dissociable from erectile function versus dysfunction, motivation being very, very different from performance. So that's another realm of distinctions. Other realms as well, desire, orgasms, arousal, all sorts of commonplace terms. The performance versus motivation dichotomy and the proceptivity, receptivity, and activity one are the major terms that are used. Next issue in terms of getting to this, how do people find out information about sexual behavior? One option is to sit there with night viewing goggles, and that's very useful for nocturnal species. But how do people find out about human sexual behavior? All sorts of ways over the years, starting with anonymous questionnaires. But a really clever technique was worked out in the 1980s. A biological mathematician named Joel Cohn getting at how to get people to tell you about very embarrassing things about their sexual lives. And this was prompted in the 80s when AIDS first swept in, and it was wildly taboo at the time in virtually every corner of this country to admit to having a less than standard white bread sexual orientation. Take a look at the extended notes to see the trick that Joel Cohn came up with, a very clever device in order to figure out what percentage of people are doing what sexually without asking anybody to give an answer that they would find perhaps to be embarrassing or grounds for all sorts of persecution. Okay. So, beginning to look at aspects of behavior and other features of the sort of rightmost end of all of this. We start off with the most central puzzle in making sense of any of this stuff, which is, so what's up with female orgasms? And we've got right off the bat the simple problem of making sense of this biological phenomenon, and one where fertility is not dependent on it. One does not need to have orgasms to become pregnant, to give birth, to pass on copies of one's genes. So what's the deal with orgasms? First off, a question we will wind up asking with a whole lot of the behavior coming down the line is, are we the only species? And all sorts of careful studies have shown that we are not the only species. Other apes, other primate species as well, monkeys and apes, show orgasm among the females, and that is detectable by all sorts of physiology we'll hear about in a while. We are not the only species. One of the really bizarre, pathetic things about trying to do research in this area was one of the first papers that ever demonstrated something which physiologically was identical to female orgasm in rhesus monkey females, which wound up being a paper in this journal Science. Down there in the footnotes, the authors had to indicate this did not make use of any federal grant money to carry out the study. Just to give you a sense of where some of this stuff sits. Okay, so what's up with female orgasm? It is not necessary for conception. It is not necessary to increase the number of copies of your genes in future generations. Despite that, there is some evidence that it facilitates fertilization. And the technical term that's always been given for that is, bizarrely enough, facilitation. The notion is something about the vaginal fluid, something about the biochemistry of, increases sperm motility. Sperms swim faster and harder and jump upstream back to spawn or whatever it is the sperm are doing with more avidity, with more energetic displays in an environment of more vaginal secretion. And orgasm greatly increases that. So the argument there being that orgasm facilitates fertilization through this sperm facilitation process. Evidence for that has always been a little bit indirect. It is not airtight that that happens. Another argument for why this increases fertility, and this is sort of an interesting one. And the notion here is that what an orgasm does is, among other things, exhausts you enormously, causing you to be far more likely to be horizontal than vertical shortly thereafter, and thus facilitating fertilization because the sperm don't have to swim straight up against gravity. I kid you not. This is one of the leading models out there. Then there's the orgasm facilitates female conception out of reinforcement theory, which is back to the it feels good, and thus you are more likely to do it again and increasing the likelihood of passing on copies of your genes. All of this is wonderful. All of these possible mechanisms where even though female orgasm is not necessary for conception, it nonetheless increases the likelihood of. That's great. However, what most of the studies have shown, though, is there is no relationship between the fertility of a woman and her propensity towards orgasm. It does not seem to play out insofar as any of this facilitation or horizontal swim enhancement techniques or whatever actually occurs. These are not big enough of an effect to actually make a difference in terms of reproductive success. So what else? What else is known about it? There is a certain degree of heritability of propensity towards orgasm in females, and this is shown with all our standard behavior genetics techniques in terms of comparing dizygotic versus monozygotic twins. We know what to do in terms of not overvaluing findings like those. Nonetheless, they are there. So, if a basic puzzle is why do females have orgasms if it's not necessary for conception, and in fact the evidence is not great that it even facilitates it, why on top of all of that, why such things as clitoral orgasms, which the studies generally show are more easily brought about than our vaginal ones? What's up with that? Even more of the same questions. Now, somewhere in there is lurking the heartbreaking possibility, in making sense of why female orgasm exists, the dreadful possibility that what we're dealing with here is a spandrel. That it is a spandrel. It is simply baggage brought along that those guys have to go through this orgasm physiology to do any stuff with sperm and pass on copies of genes and all of that. And it's simply baggage that the same physiology occurs in females. That orgasm is simply a spandrel in women. And the counter sort of scenario that's always given is this is exactly equivalent to the notion that nipples are spandrels in men, in that women, female mammals, need to go about all this lactation business, and that's part of the whole package deal. And, you know, just as it would be way too much work to evolve females without orgasms, it would be way too much to get rid of those useless nipples on men. Okay, let's have a quick survey. Yes?
Could a lot of those questions also be applied to why do males have orgasms? Because ejaculation can occur without orgasms.
Okay, so why do males have orgasms? Ejaculation can occur. It is far more voluminous in the face of an orgasm, so that's easily framed in terms of an adaptive mechanism. Okay, quick survey here. How many people, how many guys who have those useless nipples, how many of you go for the nipple as spandrel in guys theory? Whoa, is that slow in the hands? Okay, should I raise my hand? Should I not raise it? Okay. Women in the room, how many go for the female orgasm as merely spandrel theory? If I recall, there was one other question somewhere a few weeks back that only got one person fessing up to it, and it came somewhere around there also. So I don't know if that's the lighting or if people tend to sit in the same places. Okay, so not a whole lot of enthusiasm for the spandrel concepts here. Nonetheless, that needs to be seriously entertained. Okay. So, now looking at other features of the fixed action patterns, and amid, all these different species doing lordotic stuff and orgasms and ejaculation, all of that, what are some of the realms of sexual behavior that are relatively unique to humans? First off, one that used to be thought to be absolutely unique was non-reproductive sex. This is a world of difference than those species where the female ovulates for like 2.5 hours every year and everybody mates at that point, or species where somebody comes into heat, a female is an estrus. Humans have non-reproductive sex. And that was viewed as absolutely unique. What is now clear is it is not completely unique. There are lots of other species that do, probably most famously bonobo chimps and various cetaceans like dolphins. Nonetheless, it is certainly a specialty among humans. What else? Foreplay, that used to be in the category of human specialties, and it is clear by now that bonobo chimps, for example, have vastly more patience with foreplay than average humans do. We are not the only species with that either. Huge, huge controversy. How unique is homosexuality to human behavior, human sexual behavior? And what's clear increasingly is we're not the only species with that either. The original view, when people would view homosexual behavior, male-male, female-female, in other species, it would be animals in captivity, and it would be the why is there so much homosexuality in prisons argument, lack of alternatives, this was not normal, natural behavior. What is clear from ethological field studies is we are by no means the only species to have homosexual behavior. What else? One of the things that we do seem to be fairly unique about is having egalitarian sex. which is to say that there are no human cultures where, as part of the central sort of tenets of that culture, people are restricted, only a subset of individuals are allowed to reproduce. And this is a world of difference from various species. For example, New World monkeys, marmosets, where it is only one male and one female in a group that does the reproducing. Instead, humans in every culture ever seen have egalitarian sex. What else? What else is highly human? People used to think exclusively so. This endless quest for variety. And again, just take a look at these bonobo chimps and you'll see how small-minded we are when it comes to this. But something else that is indeed unique to human sexual behavior is the notion that this is something you do in private. There is no other species where the majority of sexual behavior is conducted intentionally outside the sight of everybody else. That is rather unique to humans. What else about human sexual behavior seems to be specializations? One that is fairly unique, if not entirely so, is the subset of humans who psychopathologically confuse sexual behavior with violence, and that seems not to have a whole lot of precedence. So immediately one asks other domains, masturbation. That is not remotely a human specialty. That is all sorts of other species as well, and that used to get the, well, what else is there to do when you're sitting in the zoo for the animals? What else is there to do? It is not natural, it is a default whatever, but looking out in the real world, and there is plenty of that. And one of the most implausible suggestions for an adaptive just so story thing is, why do male primates masturbate to the point of ejaculation? They tend to eat the semen afterward. Whoa, great source of protein. Go the adaptationist, everything has an adaptive basis. This one does not ring terribly true to me. What else? Fantasy. Fantasy in humans. Is that unique to humans? Obviously, we haven't a clue. But here's one suggestion to me that this is not actually the case. And this was years ago where I was watching my baboons. And there was this one low-ranking kid, this snivelly adolescent kid, where the nearest thing he has ever gotten to a female in his life was some high-ranking female in a bad mood beating on him. And he's sitting there minding his own business. And along comes, I think by any baboon male standards, the hottest female in the troop, who has a peak estrus swelling, is no doubt ovulating that day, comes walking along, followed 2 feet behind by the huge menacing male who was in the consortship with her. And our guy just sits there and doesn't even quite look at what's happening. Every now and then his eyes go up, watching them go past. And as she walks past, he gets an erection, and then goes off and masturbates. Okay, the charming, I don't know if this is even the word you can use in this setting, but the charming notion is that we've just seen evidence for some sort of internal fantasy life going on in this guy. Okay, you could be a killjoy instead and say, no, no, she was giving off wafts of pheromones and that was what was responsible for it. Nonetheless, this is about as far as we can get at asking this critical question: are we the only species that does this fantasizing stuff? Marriage. Clearly, we've heard about monogamous pair bonding species. In terms of the formal structure of marriage, it is universal. All human cultures have some version of it. Across all human cultures, more than 90% of people wind up in that culture's equivalent of a permanent, stable relationship. And this is the case in polygamous cultures. We've already heard that business, even though historically the majority of human cultures have been polygamous. Nonetheless, amid them, the vast majority of individuals have been in monogamous relationships. Amid that, nonetheless, what is also clear is, amid that highly, highly prevalent pattern of monogamous relationships, there's a lot less monogamy going around than you would think. And this was first sorted out, people like Alfred Kinsey, when first working out that questionnaire approach to people's sexual behavior, what became clear was there's a lot less faith within pair bonding, within human species, within humans in this country, and is since shown in all sorts of other societies than one would originally assume. There is social monogamy, but not necessarily anywhere near as high of rates of sexual monogamy. And what the paternity studies have shown is, in most Western European countries, the rate at which children have been fathered by an individual other than the person claiming, marriageable credit for doing so, ranges between 10 and 40% of children. How's that for a number? Okay, what else? What else tends to be a feature of human sexual behavior? What you have is, of course, not only intrinsic in the fact that there's a difference between social and sexual monogamy, you have cheating. That is a human specialty in every culture. What else is absolutely wildly human? This notion of romance. And romance is, by most sort of estimates, a relatively new invention in most cultures, maybe a couple of centuries old. And what is an even newer invention is the notion that romance, passion, etc. should persist, should last throughout the entire duration of a lifetime's marriage. That is an utterly novel concept that is perhaps 30, 40, 50 years old in most westernized countries. That's a new one as well. What that, of course, ushers in is looking at issues of divorce across all cultures. The average duration of marriages are 2 to 4 years. And people have made the argument that that is the typical duration of children being dependent on a high degree of parenting, of both parents being around. That is the average interbirth interval, 2 to 4 years in most traditional human cultures. What's the term being described then if that is the natural point at which most marriages dissolve and turn into other monogamous relationships? The term that is given is that humans tend toward being serial monogamists, moving from one monogamous relationship to another with, on the average, a lag time roughly corresponding to the interbirth interval. So that's charming. What else? What else do you have? All sorts of other aspects of human sexual variety, but ultimately, when you look at human sexual behavior versus other species, we are so boring. We are so limited. When you look at the range of unlikely things going on out there, species that are regularly hermaphroditic. And people, in fact, have done studies on how is it that a hermaphroditic animal does not try to have sex with itself, and these are usually worm-type things, and that's some version of an incest avoidance. At the same time, there are other species where individuals change sex opportunistically, all sorts of fish species where that happens, lots of species that are parthenogenic, where an individual reproduces without the benefit of anybody else's genetic input. Even stranger, there's a bunch of snake species that are parthenogenetic, but the females cannot reproduce parthenogenetically unless they mate with males. They do not actually get any sperm from the males, and they get no genetic contribution, but something about that is necessary for the parthenogenic event to occur. Okay, so all sorts of bizarrities that make our fixed action patterns look really pretty dull, but nonetheless, these are the backbones of the human fixed action patterns, and some of them wildly unique, some of them far less than people used to think, some of them very, very unprecedented. Okay, so what this allows us to do now is make our first big step. What's going on in the brain? What is the neurobiology of sexual behavior producing those fixed action patterns? And what you better bet right off the bat is we are talking about the limbic system. This is all limbic system until we see ways in which it's not just all the limbic system, but it is heavily centered, no surprise, in the limbic system. And this was being noted first around the 1930s, 1940s, with the first experiments where there were lesion studies done damaging different parts of the limbic system in animals. And what would be noted was animals' sexual behavior would change.